This is a podcast about new crops. You're going to love it. Join us on The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin.
I felt like there was so much excitement out of the starting gate, and then in some ways maybe the reality hit that it was really an industry in its infancy. And now trying to get the energy back, I think, on both the grower side, but also, on the research side too.
Welcome to The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin. I'm your host, Jerry Clark, the agricultural agent in Chippewa County with the Division of Extension with UW-Madison. My co-host today is Carl Dooley, agricultural agent in Buffalo County. Hey, Carl, how's everything today?
Hey, thanks, Jerry. It's we're looking at a white background today with a high of 25, so things are great here in Western Wisconsin.
Yeah, we're going to start to see the deer hunting season start here very shortly. So I think most of the crops are off. And as we talk industrial hemp today, it's a crop that's probably been off the ground for a few months now, but it's always good to kind of check in to see how the growing season went and kind of provide updates, what's happening from a regulation side of things and those types of things. So our guests today then are Phil Alberti. Phil is a research program manager with the Department of Horticulture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So good morning, Phil.
Hey, good morning.
And with us today as a repeat guest is Dr. Heather Darby. She's an extension agronomist with the University of Vermont. Welcome again, Heather.
Thanks for having me. It's
All
white here too.
Oh,
you guys
that's good.
Got some snow as well?
Yep, I think it's been snowing since Monday. Today's Wednesday,
Okay.
and so it's been, I don't think it's stopped. There's been I think a flurry 20 out of 24 hours. So it's
No, this was our first accumulated snow, and some places got about 7-8 inches. So.
Yeah, I got one plot left to measure yet. So I'm hoping that it doesn't cover too much ground yet. So,
Yeah, you got your broom out, Jerry, so you can
Yep.
get that one taken.
I'm gonna have to sweep it off.
We were combining yesterday trying to finish some corn before the snow. So.
Sure.
Well, Jerry, we always should mention though that Phil's at UW-Madison and Heather does have some background at Wisconsin and UW-Madison, so it's not really like welcome home, but it's like welcome back. To
alumni.
There we go.
Very good. Yeah. And just to be clear, we did trade for a draft choice to be named later for Phil to come from the University of Illinois. So Phil has just joined us. Phil, about a couple months ago, maybe, or how long you been on board?
6 weeks.
6 weeks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Blink of an eye.
I heard he had to cross the border at midnight, but we got him now. So
Well, great. And Phil, coming from Illinois, from the hemp projects down there, are you planning to bring some of that same type of leadership up here then?
Yeah, well, first off, Wisconsin was my alma mater, and I'm from Milwaukee, so it's good to be back home in both ways, which is really nice. And yeah, as far as the projects, I mean, the idea is really to keep as much of that intact as possible. We've spent the last, almost 4 years building these networks across the Midwest for a variety of research projects and collaborations across, state lines, universities, and we want to hold on to that as much as possible. So if anything, hoping that the placement here at Wisconsin will allow us to do more, if anything.
Great. And we should also, you're working directly with Dr. Shelby Ellison, correct?
Yeah, so I've known Dr. Ellison for a few years now, and we've worked together pretty closely on a lot of the hemp projects that we're bringing here to the university. But Shelby, Dr. Ellison, will be my primary boss, if you will. I'm working in her lab, but she's doing a lot of different hemp production research in genetics and breeding, which will allow me to focus on the agronomy and variety evaluation, which is really more of my strong suit. So just kind of, bringing together things that we both do well and hoping to really take the research that we're doing here up a notch.
Yeah, thanks. And I think from Carl and I aren't your boss, but we'll send you plenty of work too. So I'm glad to have you on board. So.
It's always good to have the backseat driver bosses. Is that what they're called?
Yeah. Right.
Whoa, haven't been called that for quite a while. I don't know, but I think it's great to have Phil, and it's always great to have Heather back. Heather's probably started research on hemp before most of us have. I think at least a year or two before most of us, and bringing that background, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah, I think we all see Heather as a leader in this industry.
Well, that's good. We're plugging ahead. I think, as everybody knows, there was sort of this boom, this excitement, and then just this sort of bust, and now trying to kind of amp back up, get the energy back, I think, on I would say both the grower side, but also, on the research side too. I think it felt like there was so much excitement out of the starting gate, and then I feel like in some ways maybe the reality hit that it was really an industry in its infancy, and now I feel like we're trying to get that momentum going again, with the sort of downturn of the CBD market, and kind of thinking about, okay, where are we headed with hemp at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. Heather and Phil, you can chime in on this, but Heather, just to kind of compartmentalize this between CBD and grain or fiber, what's your crystal ball looking like for those markets right now? You talked about the boom and bust, but where do you think we're going to go with this now?
Well, probably exactly where we should have started, right? So I think we did start out really focused on grain in particular. It felt like the easiest thing to do at the time, and maybe the most accessible market for farmers. But I think we all knew, like, this is a fledgling industry. And when we say that, it's just everything, right? The markets and the equipment and the infrastructure, and much of the crop that we could produce just needs to be processed before it can make its way to consumer. And that takes a lot of investment. And so, I feel like that investment that could have been happening the last few years was really directed towards this boom in the CBD market. And that really overshadowed fiber and grain. And actually, that was a bad thing. I definitely know that. We actually had an hemp oil processing facility move into Vermont the first year we could grow hemp, and they left because they couldn't get any farmers to grow grain. Everybody wanted to grow CBD. And so we lost that initial investment in infrastructure. They went out of business right away. So that was really a bummer. So what I see now is we have to build markets in these different, other areas with the grain and fiber. And it gives us in some ways a little breathing room on the research side, I think, because before, we couldn't keep up with CBD. It happened so fast. We didn't have a lot to offer. Now I feel like we're sort of in line with how fast infrastructure and markets are building for grain and fiber. And that's, I see that's where a lot of our efforts will be moving and already are for us.
And I can echo the same sentiments that we were just trying to look at so much without having that knowledge or experience. I feel 4 years in, we finally have a grip on how to establish this crop and to grow it well and to get to a point where we can harvest it. And now we're starting to ask those additional questions on the harvesting and processing side. Things are starting to come into focus. What the industry needs, what growers need, is starting to become a little bit more clear now that we have that experience. But, when everything was moving so fast, we didn't have the luxury of time. We needed to provide answers, yesterday, and we're trying so many different things and just didn't have the experience. So as a researcher, as Heather said, just kind of a refocus on what we need to look at. There is opportunities that are currently available now via grant funding at the national and state levels that are starting to make this more of a realistic possibility. And that goes down to the growing and the processing sides, where states like Missouri are offering funding to establish a processing center for this industry. But yeah, a refocus has definitely happened. And I think, over the last year or two, really figuring out where we need to spend a lot of our time.
And do you think that part of it is trying to figure out what the standards should be? I had an opportunity to go to Fort Benton, Montana, on a family trip just to see what they're doing at Indie Hemp, and they got some great things going on. They have the processing set up pretty well, it seems to me, taking it and contracting with farmers, but looking at truly what are the standards that they want, and also some other companies I've talked with. It doesn't seem like we really have a great handle yet on what are the standards, and even more importantly, how are we going to measure that? The quality of bast fiber, I don't know if we really measure quality in herd, but especially the bast fiber. Any ideas on how long that might take our industry or this hemp industry to develop those standards?
I think that feels really true at this moment. We have a bunch of projects we just applied for funding for to look at hemp fiber quality. For us, there's a market here as well for farmers that's just opened up. So we have some challenges. The first one is trying to get farmers to grow hemp again, or even consider it, especially after, sort of the last disaster many people had. So that's a barrier in itself. But then it's delivering the type of fiber that this company wants. And I'm not even sure if they know what that looks like at this time either. Like, they wouldn't know how to tell a grower what exactly they want. And so, I think it could happen relatively fast, but we need the resources and state cooperation across the country to really be able to deliver on that, because there are different processing facilities and types, and they all have different requirements. And of course, depending on, what they're producing, that has a different requirement. And for our farmers, they just have very little, they don't have any knowledge, right? I shouldn't say they have little, they don't have any. And they don't know, they can be told when to harvest, but to me, it's from that point forward, like, then what? And that's, really the questions we're trying to answer, especially in our humid climates. Are we actually going to be able to field ret this material into a high quality bast fiber that could make textiles? Or are we just going to be able to make, produce a fiber that can go into plastics or bedding or whatever? So anyway.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a great point with the, what do farmers know or not know, and, not knowing anything. And I think that's where I've had one farmer tell me at a field day that, well, that's what extension's for. You guys make the mistakes, you figure it out. And I think, and Carl and I have joked about this, that, we're finally ahead of the curve on something where we've got this, we got the production stuff ready. And when the market's ready, we're ready to go, or at least we can at least help farmers. Because I think one thing we've looked at, kind of back to your quality point, is when we've done the seeding rate studies, and you get these really pencil thin type stems versus these, that are maybe the diameter of a dime or a nickel. And it's like, well, which one do they want? And it's like, well, I don't know. We're just trying to figure out what happens when we change the seeding rate. And then it varies so much by variety. So a lot to learn yet, but at least if those are the questions I think farmers are going to have if there's an opportunity to get this off the ground again.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting, Heather, what you said about can we in our humid climates, because we're pretty similar, Wisconsin and Vermont, especially where we're at. I asked that question to the folks out in Montana, and they think we're going to be the place that grows high quality fiber because they can't get theirs to ret. They don't have enough moisture, and they don't have enough water to irrigate it to get it to ret. And there's no dew because they've been so dry. And this has been 5-6 years that they've been that dry, that they had it out in the field 2 months and it didn't do anything besides change colors. So I think we got a lot of things to work out between, like you said, across state lines. Trying to figure this out should be challenging, interesting, fun, whatever term you want to use.
Yeah, I know with our initial retting trials, it just seems like we can go from good to bad really quick. And one of the projects that we're working on now are sort of like, what are the cues? So I think about this with our work in hops that we all did a while ago, where we all said, well, how do you know when they're ready to harvest? And the people that have grown hops out west said, well, you just know. And it's like asking a dairy farmer, how do you know when the hay's ready to bale? Well, you just know. So, we're trying to figure out what are those cues with hemp fiber when it's laid down on the ground. Are there visual cues as we're learning? Is there, any kind of, there are some NIR assessments that have been done. Are there some kind of cues we can use that are going to help the farmers and ourselves know, okay, now's the time, or we're getting close? So that's a little bit of something that we're trying to focus on this year.
So Phil, in your case with coming from Illinois, or what you're seeing early on in Wisconsin here, what are those production things that you're working through? I know I've caught wind of some of Shelby's work on the breeding or some of the genetics side of it, but where do you see that headed in terms of whether it's CBD or with for grain or fiber?
Well, I think, some of the things that we're going to be focusing on are, large scale farm level harvesting, trying to determine which equipment's going to be suited for grain harvesting and trying to experiment with various equipment, messing around with planting dates and varieties to try to find a more manageable grain type hemp. So what do I mean by that is, we did some experiments this last year and we had planted late with the intention of harvesting the grain. And we have planted in mid-June and we were hoping that the plants would be about soybean or a tall soybean height. Well, they were 10 to 11 feet tall and we were not able to go through with the soybean header like we had originally planned. So messing around with, evaluating planting dates and then also machinery to try to find a way that we can actually have our producers harvesting this equipment in a kind of a safe and risk or lower risk way. Because our one of our challenges right now is getting not only growers to grow this, but going through and trying to harvest the grain crop. They're worried about the wear and tear on their equipment, the fiber wrapping. We want to be able to provide them with realistic options, whether that's equipment that they have or have put away on the shelf and haven't used for some time. So we're trying to evaluate machinery and figure out ways that we can actually do this at the farm level instead of just on a research trial where we're going out and perhaps using small plot equipment or hand harvesting, which is what we had to do a lot in our first few years of production research to get a baseline. So it's all about scaling up. And I feel like moving forward, we're going to continue to look at variety evaluations, best management practices, and then equipment, harvesting equipment specifically is something that's going to be a heavy focus moving forward.
Have either of you, Heather or Phil, run into production issues in terms of diseases or insects or those kind of things? I think early on here in Wisconsin, we really haven't had them yet. Japanese beetle hangs around a little bit, but we haven't seen major problems on the pest management side. Anything emerging on that side of the world?
Not so much with grain and fiber, although we do see like fusarium head lice.
That'd be a new one.
Fusarium head blight, and on some of the varieties, especially the shorter stature ones. And I have a feeling the weeds also are a bigger issue in those varieties for us anyway too. So I'm not sure if it's the variety itself or just sort of the stature and not drying out maybe as quickly as some of the other varieties that are taller, maybe get more airflow, etc. But we seem to have that problem with certain varieties where the heads just completely rot, and it'll make up a good portion of the plots. But outside of that, at least, most of what we see with issues is in the real early season with establishment.
Yeah, I think the what we've learned, I think, Carl, and you can chime in here, but for grain and fiber I guess for CBD as well, but especially for grain and fiber, that soil temperature really needs to be warm. We planted one plot 2 years ago before Memorial Day. And that one struggled, it seemed like, all year. And if we wait till mid-June, we have a much better germination. Just the plant seems to be healthier. Everything just seems to work better when you're patient and let that soil warm up. And without any registered herbicides, letting those seeds germinate, those weed seeds germinate, tilling it maybe a couple times, just to try to knock that seed bank down seems to be something that we've had a little bit better success, at least here in Chippewa County, as well as Carl, you've experienced it. But our other site is a Whirling Thunder site down at the Ho Chunk Nation, which is an organic production system. And they've observed that as well, where if they can get that plant out of the ground quick enough, it will kind of shade those weeds out. And this year we didn't seem to have quite the trouble, other than the wheel track
Right.
between the
Yeah,
plots seemed to be the issue.
You're right, Jerry. The 2 years that I tried to plant early, both were disasters. We couldn't, the weeds were awful. The plants germinated when it was warm. Then we had cool temperatures for 10 days and the weeds all grew, the hemp didn't. And waiting till mid-June just seems to work way better for weed control and getting the plant going. The other thing, we did have some white mold this year in a couple varieties that we noticed. Not real heavy. We followed soybeans, so it's probably a natural that we would have plenty of vector available, but not that it would reduce yield or anything like that. It wasn't that bad, but we did observe some of that this year.
So the
Yeah,
other,
we've
go ahead,
seen a
Heather.
little white mold too. Not a lot, but I would agree over time, certainly it could definitely contribute to issues with other crops that have white mold.
Jerry, you bring up a pretty good point about planting. I think when we first started growing hemp, we were so focused with getting it in early to try to focus on biomass production. But I think, at least in my own experience, the last few years, it can tolerate a bit of a later planting date and really establish just fine, continue to grow. I think looking at flower, especially from a fiber production standpoint, flowering date is more important, I think, in a lot of ways, and getting a good establishment than an early planting date itself is allowing it to grow. I've seen varieties that put up, they're 10 feet tall and they put up almost half of that biomass in a 2-3 week period, where it's about getting good establishment and allowing the crop to do what it needs to do. So, I think that's just one more of those points of things that we've really started to understand, but it took time and experience to really understand that.
And Phil, maybe you could comment on this too, but I found it really interesting yesterday. There was a national webinar on hemp and industrial hemp, mainly fiber. But there was a couple of the states and a couple of companies that are really pushing that we need herbicides. We need to make hemp Roundup ready so that we can apply Roundup to it. And part of me says this is kind of the beauty, if we can put this in a conventional rotation, that we can get away without using Roundup for a year. If we're growing corn, soybeans conventionally and we put in hemp, maybe we don't need Roundup and maybe we shouldn't rush in there. What are your thoughts, both you and Heather, and Jerry? What are your thoughts about that philosophy? I get a little concerned when we're going to do one more crop with Roundup.
I mean, I think, there's certainly a utility in these herbicides being used, but we've had to get creative with hemp the last few years because we haven't had those options, which for me as a researcher has been fun, is finding ways to kind of compete without having an herbicide option available. So, that seed preparation and getting good establishment timing is very important, but we've had very good experiences with getting a good crop established without an herbicide application and having it withstand the competition throughout the season, which, for me tells me there's a lot of opportunity there to continue that work and use hemp as a potential option, like you say, for a cropping option without having to use those herbicides. So, it's not a one size fit all. And I certainly think there's going to be room for incorporations of herbicides within the hemp production, but its ability and natural ability at higher densities to outcompete with weeds, if you get it established well, provides a tremendous opportunity to continue with those sort of production practices.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we see some of the research on hemp, especially fiber hemp, focused on environment. There's lower input numbers, et cetera, and all of that really has to do with how the plant's grown, not just because it's hemp. And so if we want to actually continue to promote that crop as a crop with these environmental benefits, I think we do have to really think about using hemp's capabilities to suppress weeds, which is a real thing. And we've all seen that. If you get a good stand, I don't have any weed problems. I can't name name or even think of a plot where we got a really good stand of hemp where there was hardly anything in the understory, even when it started with a good number of weeds. And of course, like has already been noted, there's always going to be a case where we're proven wrong and we could have really used that herbicide. But I agree. I think it's a real opportunity to help break some, of those herbicide cycles and herbicide resistant weeds. And, and if we can figure out how to get good stands regularly, I don't really see where we're going to need them much.
Yeah, because my site's loaded with water hemp and resistant water hemp, and Jerry has a touch of it up in his site too. And I had none in my plot this year, even where it wasn't really aggressive. Some of the varieties, some of the auto flower varieties, not real aggressive. I didn't have any in there. I was amazed.
Yeah.
You also make me think about the other end of this too, is, not just the production of the hemp itself, but before and after, from a cover crop standpoint, depending on your use. So if you're pushing planting dates late for grain into June, you have a lot of time to get, that early spring biomass production from a previous planted cover crop. Or on the back end, if you're harvesting a fiber crop in August, let's just say here in Wisconsin or in Illinois, that provides you a tremendous opportunity for fall cover crop growth going into the winter. So I think there's a lot of questions we have about how it fits into production systems, particularly from a conservation cropping or sustainable ag standpoint, that could certainly be addressed now that we kind of know which direction we want to take this.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go with the next question. So great point, Phil, is where this fits in, because we did some, our planting here in Chippewa County mid-June, and by mid-August, 60 days, we were getting 3 ton of dry matter, maybe 4 ton of dry matter, just by checking to see what we had out there. And even from a feed quality standpoint, even though you can't legally feed it to anything, we did some forage tests just to see what's this stuff doing. And we were getting in 2021, it was right there with alfalfa in terms of protein. Fiber was a little bit higher, obviously, but those kind of parameters were actually pretty decent. So timing, like any other crop, if you're going to get the quality, you got to hit the right timing. But like you said, I think if you can capture that much tonnage in a short window, or at least use it as a cover crop, and then that opens that window up for that third crop to break up some of these cycles. That's where we're starting to think what's next, or how can we, really adapt this crop into a kind of a 3 crop rotation, with whether it's corn or soybeans or winter wheat or cover crop, whatever it is. Oh, go ahead, Heather.
Well, I was actually thinking about the planting date piece that we were talking about. And early on, we did planting date studies 3 years in a row. And each year we had a different sort of successful planting date, and the first year we grew hemp, it was 3rd week of May. And the second year we grew hemp, it was the 6th of June. And the third year we did it, it was like the 10th of June or something. And it just, I think it made me realize that, and I have heard this from other growers in other regions, like mostly Canada, that the nice thing about hemp is that you do have a wide planting window. There's a wider opportunity there versus maybe something like corn, where, especially if we're growing for fiber and even for grain, we can still maximize yields if we plant into June. But if the conditions are right and the ground is warm and we've had an early spring or whatever it is, and the moisture is perfect, then don't be afraid to plant on the 3rd week of May either. And I think that's what I have learned over the years, is that I got to keep my eye on the conditions. The soil's got to be warm, and it's got to be the conditions where I know, as Carl said, that seed's going to jump out of the ground as soon as possible. And there's not some cold forecast in the future. It wasn't just like an off week, because when we've been unsuccessful is when it was warm, so we planted, but then it got cold and wet, and then we just had terrible stands. So I think it's nice that there's options, a wider planting window option, but people have to be thinking about the conditions more so, I think, because it's not as forgiving as some of our other crops, I don't think.
So as we move along in the regulation side of things, we think about Wisconsin has moved under no longer has their own program. We've moved under the USDA program. Where do you see that, in your crystal ball? Where do you see the regulation side of things headed from that standpoint, Phil?
It's just going to be an adjustment for growers, I think, to really understand, the rules and regulations that they're required to follow. It's just kind of a whole new system of the USDA taking over. So where you get your testing done, who is coming out is going to be handled differently. And so I really would encourage growers to make sure they are understanding the federal rules that we are, expected to follow. I think it's better now that it has been that we are starting to get on some sort of universal language, even with the state plans in some cases, like Illinois doing their own thing and not following the federal guidelines. There's still a lot of that language is consistent, which is going to be a step in the right direction, I think, for growers across the country, really, and for processors as well. So, I think in the long run, these regulation changes are needed to get us where we need to be. So we're all kind of in agreement. And I can speak to that coming from Illinois, where we were what was considered a Delta 9 state from a compliance standpoint for the first, 3 years of hemp being legal here in the States. And that caused a bunch of issues for growers from a compliance standpoint, from interstate commerce, where, they're on one side of state lines and it's compliant hemp, and they cross over into another state and it's technically, marijuana trafficking. So I think we're starting to get to a point where a lot of those, the language is going to be on the same level. And I think that's going to be a benefit to everybody. In addition to that, I think the research exemptions that are going to be allowed for universities to conduct hemp research are going to be, very beneficial by allowing us to do specific hemp production research under a very specific license that will eliminate some of those challenges that our traditional growers have to do and follow, so we can continue to do hemp production research and figure out what's working and what's not.
Our situation is the same in Vermont. We were a Delta 9 state too, but now we've been turned over to the USDA, which sounds like a lot of states are heading that direction. And in our state now, recreational cannabis or marijuana is also legal. So that was part of the reasoning for the state to turn their hemp program over to the USDA and kind of focus on their recreational program administration instead. I think for growers, at least here, that's what makes us not the same as so many other crops, is that it's still regulatory, even if it's legal to grow it. And that still, I think, is a pretty big barrier for a lot of growers. There's just more red tape. And it just, for so many people, especially I think now that we're moving into fiber and grain, what's the added value to them for growing those crops? Is the market such that it makes sense to go get your fingerprints taken and just go through all this trouble because you're going to, the payout is there and it's worth all the baloney. I shouldn't call it baloney, but that's what I hear from growers. I don't have time for that. We only have one fingerprinting place in the entire state of Vermont. So it's also it's a small state, so maybe that's irrelevant, but it's a pain, So that still remains a barrier. It'll be interesting if I had my magic ball to see what happens with the new farm bill. And I think there'll be a lot of pressure being put on some of the hemp rules and regulations. It'll be interesting to see what happens here in the new farm bill, if any of that changes.
That's an excellent point. That is coming up, and it'll be something to watch.
Yeah, you read my mind, Heather. I was going to ask if you were appointed to the study committee for that part of the farm bill.
Yeah, but it's important. And, I think, again, for hemp to really, I think, take off, especially in these crops they will be lower value. It's not going to be like CBD that if they become commodities, why is anybody going to do it unless the payout's really much higher? It still is risky.
And that was the discussion in the webinar yesterday, was that crop insurance and all of these kind of things, I know a few people that work at some lending institutions in Chippewa County, and they basically said they don't really give out loans to anybody that's producing it. Just even if it's, they got all the paperwork in, they just said, we're not taking the risk of, because we don't know if it's with a crop failure or whatever it is. So they want to treat it. I know the goal from yesterday's meeting was, let's try to get it to be a commodity. But when you're competing with corn and soybeans with the prices they are, it's going to take another correction in those markets, or if those markets crash, then there'll be that renewed interest, I think, where you start to see farmers say, okay, I can give up some land because I'm not going to make money on corn and soybeans, or there's an environmental benefit that's proven along the way.
I think outside of just like, the challenges from, going in, getting your thumbprint, going through all the whole licensing is, and then also the challenges of the actual market of going somewhere with this crop is from a compliance standpoint. It's expensive to get this material tested, whether it depends on the state or, the tribe or the federal program you're under, but to pay to somebody to come out to sample your crop, to go in and get it tested, and then to prove it's compliant, it can be very expensive depending on where you are. And so, I think something that may be an opportunity moving forward that was written into the Farm Bill and then hopefully will get expanded on in the future is the idea of performance-based sampling in a way that we can, via certification and establishing varieties that have been shown to be compliant over time, that are tried and true, I think will be a significant way to reduce input costs for growers and kind of be one of those big barriers to production. So, that's something I'm going to be keeping an eye on, moving forward. I know some states have done a successful performance-based sampling methodology that has been approved. And I think that'll be something to keep an eye on at the state or federal level for basically finding varieties that are going to be compliant and not have to follow the same stringent rules that you were forced to when proving that a variety is compliant.
Well, this is always great information. Before we wrap up, I think if you could both just give me some background on any new publications, resources, things like that. We have our Cutting Edge webpage that you can get the podcasts on. And I think we have over 4,000 subscribers now, right, Carl? Somewhere in that ballpark?
Yeah, it's somewhere in that range, yes.
So I know for impact statements, Heather, an extension, I'll send you those numbers. So
all right, here we go.
But I know we've got new web pages being developed, and there's always research papers out there and those kind of things. So I'll start with you, Phil. What's happening in terms of the resources for any growers or processors that might be interested in investigating the hemp industry?
Well, I'll start off by saying that we are developing a emerging crops webpage for hemp. It's going to be basically the clearinghouse for all University of Wisconsin hemp production resources. If you Google emerging crops Wisconsin, it should take you there.
Just a quick interruption to say that the emerging crops website is not live yet, but we're working hard to bring it to the finish line, and we'll let you know on the Cutting Edge podcast once we've gone public with it. Okay, back to the show.
But that's going to be the place to go to look for all of our research reports from the last few years for grain and fiber production, as well as high cannabinoid hemp. Variety trials from 2022 are going to be up there at some point this fall/winter. We're still working on those, so keep an eye out for those things. But what I will point out is we have a lot of opportunities for collaboration, which, outside of our production resources are really going to be a driving force to get people to work with us here. If you're interested in conducting any grain, fiber, or high cannabinoid hemp trials, we have various grant opportunities that are going to allow us to provide seed and costs of testing to participate in these projects. And for our grain and fiber trials, may even provide a nice stipend for participating in those. So if you're interested in doing any of that, just reach out to me and I'd be happy to get you that information. Also, if you're aware of any feral hemp sites across the Midwest, as part of our larger effort at the national level to collect this germplasm, to incorporate it into our breeding programs and just protect this, feral wild hemp, we need it. So please let us know. That's going to be one of our bigger projects, our National Feral Hemp Collection. And then our disease survey. So if you're a hemp grower and you're experiencing disease or pest pressure and you have questions, you can work with us to get those answers. We can do diagnostics visually or submit them to our our diagnostic lab, and we can work with you to get those answers. So a lot of opportunities for collaboration. I guess I'll just end it by saying, if you're a hemp producer in the region, come take a look at our website. It's going to have a ton of production resources, not just from Wisconsin, but from all over the country. And it's going to be the most up-to-date place for all of our hemp production that we have available.
Thanks, Phil. Anything on your end, Heather, that's new coming out? Oh,
I just put up our website. I made a slide. But it's backwards.
All right. So Google.
This is a podcast slide. Can people see it?
Podcast.
Can they see it? No, they're just
Probably
listening.
not. We can
Oh, dang
close
it.
enough. We'll put it on the website.
Right. We have a website, and there is a hemp section to that. We do post all our research every year, so everything that we're finding, we're sharing immediately. And then we have lots of videos. We've done a ton of webinar series focused on all, aspects of hemp, and kind of gearing up to do our winter hemp conference, which we've done for quite a while now. And I think we're going to keep it virtual, even past COVID, to draw in, a wider audience, especially now that sort of hemp grower numbers are a little bit down, or a lot down. Making sure that we can get information out broadly remains important. So,
yeah.
Great. And Jerry, we should mention that, mention two things. First of all, that the people that know Jerry and I, we did pass our FBI fingerprint test. And so people can feel comfortable about that. And secondly, we are also planning on we called it a virtual field day a couple of years ago when we did on hemp. And we're going to try to bring that back this winter also. And we may be hitting you up, Heather. You never know. So expect a call or email.
Well, again, any other final comments? I really appreciate Phil and Heather for taking time to do another podcast with us today, and hope we can cross paths this winter as we do field days and virtual events and things like that. It's been great.
Brought to you by the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension.